Leanne is Associate Professor of English Literature at the National University of Singapore. She's also president of the Southeast Asian Society for 18th Century Studies. And Anne works on how philosophical and scientific concepts are articulated in narrative and how durable these concepts are when they're translated into literary form. So she specializes in British literature of the long 18th century, with particular emphasis on travel literature, early prose fiction, and the history of ideas, especially early aesthetic thinking. Her first book, which is fantastic, Minds in Motion, Imagining Empiricism in 18th Century British Travel Literature, which was published by Bucknell Press in 2017, illuminates how 18th century travel offers authors surprisingly cogent interrogations of the century's most pressing epistemological questions. She's also recently completed the first critical edition of Margaret Cavendish's Grounds of Natural Philosophy, which was first published in 1668 and just came out recently with Broadview Press. Her work has also appeared in journals like Configurations, 18th Century Life, and Studies in Travel Writing. And you can also read her thoughts, and you should read her thoughts, on the television series Bridgerton in the Times Literary Supplement. So, and Belle, I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for noticing the Bridgerton piece too. That was something that was fun to write. I had to get off my chest. Okay, so thank you so much for organizing. Thank you to Sophie and E and Arnaud for organizing these important initiatives. And a special thanks to Arnaud because he has been my kind of faithful assistant and companion across several months of planning. And this is such an important initiative in general, but especially now as we remain so kind of frustratingly estranged. So it's nice to see everyone here. And thank you for appearing too. We have this huge global group. So this is exciting. I'd also like to point out my Cavendish t-shirt. I'm not sure if this is entirely visible. This is a recent gift. I can think of no better audience for this shirt. So I bought it today. So I'm going to start my timer. I don't want to go over. I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to offer a few brief thoughts on Cavendish and mental illness. I'm going to try to lay down the basic framework for her thinking on this topic, not in any way to limit the conversation, but just so we can kind of start on the same page. And then I'll introduce our speakers and we'll hear what they have to say as well. So to begin, start my timer. The reason why I wanted to run the session. So I did this not because I have a set of conclusions or like brilliant ideas or answers about the topic, but rather because I'm genuinely curious about it. And I'm eager to hear what everyone has to say about it as well. And as is so often the case with Cavendish, who is of course a committed probabilist, she tends to give us a series of hypotheses about health and illness and irregular behavior within the natural world, but is obviously willing to change and evolve her opinions over time. And she's also willing to entertain multiple and sometimes conflicting points of view. And she's quite self-aware about this and playful and sometimes even ironic. And Stephen has written really beautifully about this, of course, too. But her theory of illness in her later work, her later philosophy from the 1660s is salient, and I think it's really understudied as well. And I'm also invested in this topic because it offers a convenient avenue into a whole range of big debates about Cavendish at the moment in regard to free will and autonomy, the existence of chaos or disorder in nature, health and medicine, the imagination, and broadly the history of mental illness and cognition in the brain as well. And to me, her materialist theory of mind, and specifically her material theory of illness, seems vital to the period's debates about how our bodies work or fail to work in this case as well. So what is mental illness for Cavendish? How can we define this? And of course, that's a modern term that we're using. So in her later philosophy, Cavendish outlines three basic mechanisms for illness to occur or take root in material bodies. And I should just preface this. I know most of you know this already, but just again, so that we're kind of starting from the same starting point. For Cavendish, everything, all of the world, all of the cosmos, all of ourselves, everything is material and made up of the elemental base substance matter, which is living and moving and sentient, and is itself composed of the rational, sensitive, and inanimate parts. And while those subparts have specific roles or functions, they can never be separated or distilled. And so if we divide matter into smaller and smaller and smaller parts, we always remain with that blended matter. So I just wanted to put that out there so the rest of this makes sense. So the primary pathway that Cavendish discusses when it comes to illness is the irregular motion of material parts caused by what she calls patterning, which is a term I know many of you are familiar with. So here, in a process of imitation, material parts mimic or copy the actions of other parts within that same society or creature or between creatures. Like her theory of perception and her theory of motion, which both resist mechanical accounts of physical contact, this theory of contagion presumes the conscious action of organic matter. As she says, infection is an act of imitation. And this comes from the suggested reading for today, of course, too. For one part cannot give another part a disease, but only that some imitate the same sort of irregular actions of other parts, of which some are near adjoining imitators and some occasion a general mode. And here she seems to refer to either kind of localized or systemic infections. So far from the passive reception of disease, here the cogent self-moving parts mimic or are persuaded by the irregular motions of other entities, which can be internal parts near or far, people, objects, vapors, foods, poisons, etc. So this type of disease is occasioned or triggered, but still requires volition in that specific parts decide to imitate a regular motion. One thing to keep in mind here is that there can be multiple triggers at once and multiple parts can be affected. And so, for instance, in relation to madness specifically, which she talks about, you can have madness of the rational parts, of the sensitive parts, or both, and you can have multiple causes as well. Another thing to note here is that because all of nature is infused with rational matter and is thinking and knowing and alive, madness can occur in any part of the body. So it's not just confined to the brain. So the term mental illness itself, which again is anachronistic, takes on a rather different meaning in the Cavendishian universe, because literally like all of anything can go mad because of its thinking matter. So the second primary pathway for illness that Cavendish outlines is a kind of spontaneous decay. So in this process, irregularity might occur due to an unprompted decay of vital parts, is the term she usually uses for this, which seems to account for aging and death, but she does not spend a lot of time on this particular category. And of course, even in the process of decay, organic parts never die or disappear in this universe, but rather migrate into new forms. So that's the second path. And finally, and fascinatingly, I think Cavendish suggests that illness can occur via conceit, the term she uses, whereby rational figurative motions, thoughts or imaginations, create real manifestations, real physical manifestations of illness. So thinking of an illness can sometimes cause illness. And this occurs somewhat confusingly out of self-love and sympathy, as Cavendish explains. And again, this is in the suggested reading for today. Because all parts of nature have a rational fear, she explains, of disuniting or dissolving. That is the reason that upon the perception of such a disease, the rational, through some disorder, figures that disease, and the sensitive corporal motions take a pattern from the rational. And so they're inclined to agree, even if the original action is irregular. Here then, ideas are powerful enough to cause the material manifestation of illness. So what we would now call hypochondria, thinking of an illness and then exhibiting symptoms, becomes this material condition in this case. And fascinatingly, the performance of disease is physically identical to the disease itself. It's just triggered in a different way, from what I can tell. And this also does have some structural overlaps with patterning as well. So those are the three basic mechanisms which we can talk more about that she tends to offer for irregular motions that lead to illness, including madness or mental instability of any kind, and erratic motions of mind and body in general. So for the purposes of the following conversation, we might also note a few other things to consider about these pathways. So the first thing to note, I think, and I know our speakers will discuss some of these ideas too, is that irregular motions are not unnatural. As Cavendish announces, nature poising her actions by opposites, there must need be irregularities as well as regularities. So they're not unnatural, but they are atypical. So that's one thing to point out. a big question that I'm sure will come up today in terms of our breakout rooms or later discussion is the question of why this occurs. If organic matter is governed by self-love and united love, it's uncertain why it does occasionally act in these atypical ways, or why it causes discord or chaos or illness, or why it, as Cavendish says, puts herself to pain. And so she gives us kind of hints about what occasions these irregularities to occur, but I don't think we have like a kind of satisfying answer as to why that ever does occur. More generally, in the arena of medicine, and especially in her privileging of Galenism over newer chemical alternatives, Cavendish has often been seen as old guard, as Jacqueline Broad has argued. But I think some of her medical thinking is more avant-garde than we've acknowledged. For instance, she sided with Van Helmont in viewing illness as a material entity rather than a humoral imbalance, which is interesting in itself, and also presages contemporary understandings of disease. And her theory of imitation has some loose parallels with contemporary medicine as well. As we now understand, the operations of genes and cells can malfunction and spread corruption to other parts as well. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, traditionally, I think has been seen as a kind of a defender of old ways in the realm of medicine, but I'm not sure that's necessarily true. As usual, in this model of illness, we find some political correlates, which some people might be interested in discussing, as imitating the wrong example or the wrong kind of leader causes chaos and discord. Often Cavendish uses the metaphor of the Commonwealth to talk about the body as well. I'm just listing basic points that we can discuss later. Two more things I wanted to note, and then I'm finished, is Cavendish recognizes the imperfect nature of curatives and is highly skeptical of what she calls universal remedies or universal medicine. And this is kind of a swipe at Van Helmont and other alchemists. In her earlier work, she does spend more significant time on remedies. Later on in Grounds, for example, she devotes less time to these, but she still is interested in how parts might be restored. Very famously in her appendix to Grounds, she's got that wild section on restoring beds that might bring life to annihilated bodies. I mean, so these are things that still interest her, even though she catalogs them less extensively in Grounds, which is kind of the third edition of PPO. So the final point I wanted to make, just for the purpose of discussion, is that very interestingly to me, Cavendish does not cite the imagination as the root of madness, as so many of her contemporaries did. Even though this faculty is of great interest to her, Hobbes and many others trace madness to an unruly imagination and stipulated that imagination must be carefully monitored and directed towards some end in order to avoid spinning into madness. And the closest she comes to doing this is her concept of conceit, as I just outlined. But she doesn't spend a lot of time on that mechanism, and it's not the primary cause of disease for her. So I'm curious about Cavendish's kind of position in that line of thinking, because that's very much kind of ongoing around her, and she doesn't seem to entirely subscribe to that. She's obviously interested in how minds move and how they produce knowledge. And she's so interested in this kind of rapid fire mental activity that she celebrates. But she never really talks about how that might spin into madness, as many others do, which I think is really interesting. So as you can see, we have lots of different pathways into this topic. And there's a lot to discuss in terms of lots of different levels to discuss, I guess, too, in terms of the physiological, the philosophical, and also the conceptual and the literary. So there's lots of avenues that I'm excited to discuss further. So that's the very basic introduction for me. And I think now I should introduce our first speaker. So I'll introduce Leanne. By the way, if you see bugs flying around me, it's not because I live in filth, but rather because there's a ladybug infestation in the tree next to me. So there's lots of them around me at the moment. Just wanted to let everyone know that. Okay, so Leanne Habenek is a lecturer in literature at MIT, where she received her undergrad degrees in literature and brain and cognitive studies. These studies in turn inspired her first book, The Subtle Knot: Early Modern Literature and the Birth of Neuroscience, which has an awesome chapter on Cavendish. Most recently, she was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Strasbourg, and prior to that was an assistant professor of literature at Bard College. She has held fellowships with the Newhouse Center for the Humanities at Wellesley College, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and various research libraries. Her current book project, Unfolding the Early Modern Page, investigates Renaissance pop-up books and other feats of paper engineering, connecting these experiments in printing to modern research in cognitive science and reading, which sounds very, very interesting. So I will pass the floor and mute myself.
Okay, I'm going to start my timer to make sure that I adhere to the timeline. I wanted to thank, give a big thank you to Anne and to and Sophie and Anol and E for organizing this. I had the great pleasure of attending last weekend, and it was fantastic, and really got my own mind spinning. And I'm going to come back to this idea of spinning momentarily. Excuse me. So I wanted to open with a passage from, one moment here. Yeah, sorry. Anyways, so this is a passage from probably my favorite passage in all of Cavendish. And just to set it up, it's an exchange between the Empress in the Blazing World and her bear men subjects, who are fascinated and really trying to attempting to think about and plead their case for telescopes. And of course, the Empress is incredibly skeptical of the utility of these telescopes. So I'll read the passage. The bear men, being exceedingly troubled at Her Majesty's displeasure concerning their telescopes, she's asked them to destroy the telescopes, kneeled down and in the humblest manner petitioned that they might not be broken. For, said they, we take more delight in artificial delusions than in natural truths. Besides, we shall want employments for our senses and subjects for arguments. For were there nothing but truth and no falsehood, there would be no occasion to dispute. And by this means, we should want the aim and pleasure of our endeavors in confuting and contradicting one another. Neither would one man be thought wiser than another, but all would be alike knowing and wise, or all would be fools. Wherefore we most humbly beseech your imperial majesty to spare our glasses, which are our only delight and as dear to us as our lives. So Her Majesty, on principle, really rejects the idea of telescopes and lenses more broadly. And yet the plaintiveness of the bear men has always really struck me as crucial to interpreting Cavendish's sense of natural philosophy more broadly, and specifically as it pertains to her ideas on madness, because this is a sticking point. Artificial delusions ought to be what Cavendish is actually trafficking in. She posits herself as empress of an entire world of her own making, and a fictional world in the root sense. So why would the Empress, who's the stand-in for Cavendish here, it gets more complicated, as you know, the more that you read The Blazing World, why would she denounce artifice in favor of natural truths? And I think what I want to suggest here today is that Cavendish articulates a connection between the sense of generation and madness. So madness is linked to how Cavendish perceives herself and presents herself, and as well as how she understands other people's perceptions of her. So I want to think about why she is, sort of rejecting the idea of the bear men, embracing this artificial delusion, when she herself seems to delight in artifice and in what she's calling here delusion. There's a play and a revelation and a reveling in this idea of delusion that I think is really fascinating in Cavendish's works. So Cavendish presents a kind of creative lineage, and in her own intellectual conception, ideas are formed in the brain and then they can be moved out and propagated. And it's this form of propagation that a lot of Cavendish's peers, as we all know, found disturbing, to say the least. So Pepys, calls her, at best, he calls her silly and romantic. And Dorothy Osborne, after reading Cavendish's Poems and Fancies, claims that there are many sober people in Bedlam. And the most impactful commentary, I think, was by Mary Evelyn, the wife of the diarist John Evelyn. And she comments that as Cavendish is an original, she may never have a copy. And this is anathema to Cavendish's relationship to her own works. This notion of insanity as somehow shutting off the creative process is a dangerous thing, I think, for Cavendish. Mary Evelyn, as Katie Whitaker describes in her fabulous and well-known biography, Mad Madge, says that Mary Evelyn in their meeting ran away from Cavendish because she was afraid of infection, and she didn't want her own thoughts to be tainted or corrupted by Cavendish's thoughts. Now, I think that Cavendish actually anticipated this kind of readerly recoiling, and she undercuts herself repeatedly in her prefatory writing, especially in her preface to her Observations upon Experimental Philosophy. She sees her critics and sort of anticipates them as interpreting her constant generation as worrisome and almost epidemic, just like Evelyn was doing. So she writes here, it is probable, some will say, that my much writing is a disease, but what disease they will judge it to be, I cannot tell. I do verily believe that they will take it to be a disease of the brain, but surely they cannot call it an apoplectical or lethargical disease. And none of us would claim that at all. Perhaps they will say it is an extravagant or at least a fantastical disease, but I hope they will rather call it a disease of wit. And for Cavendish, here in Observations and in The Blazing World and in many other places, disease is not a negative or pejorative idea. It is rather a pathway to creation and creative thought, especially in her fiction. So it's not that her writing is potentially at stake, it's that her much writing is what is at stake here. And she believes it will cause readers to wonder if she's ill. And so she sees that other people can interpret her as potentially being ill. But for Cavendish, this illness isn't a dangerous thing. It's something that is communicable. It's a means of, it's almost like the printing press of her mind. This is the way that her ideas will propagate. And the nature of this disease is a disease of wit. And I know that Anne was mentioning that Cavendish doesn't link imagination and madness necessarily. And I agree with that, but this idea of wit and play as being propagative is completely fascinating for Cavendish. And just to give you some examples of how she suggests the relationship between thoughts and the mind that contains them. And this is another kind of larger question, a larger concern of mine for how Cavendish articulates the connection between thoughts and the actual physical matter of the brain. So she tries on a lot of metaphorical relationships in the world's Olio, and I've listed some of them here. The mind is like a commonwealth, and the thoughts are the citizens therein, or the thoughts are like the household servants who are busily employed about the mind's affairs, who is the master. The thoughts are like stars in the firmament, where some are fixed, others like wandering planets, others again are only like meteors. The head of a man is like a wilderness, where thoughts as several creatures live therein. The brain is like a forest, and thoughts as passengers that travel therein, making inroads and beating out paths. And I think the best one, and it's breakfast time here, so I'm thinking about this, is thoughts are like pancakes, and the brain is the pan, wherein they are tossed and turned by the several objects as several hands. So these comparisons are so wide-ranging, and they shift from the domestic sphere of pancake making to the heavenly firmament, and they share some distinguishing features. So each example involves a kind of containing field, a commonwealth, a firmament, wilderness, forest, pancake pan, within which something else, citizens and stars, creatures, passengers, and pancakes are constantly in potentially chaotic motion. And I want to suggest, and I hope that this will spur some conversation, I want to suggest that this sort of restlessness is one way, is one path to to linking creativity and madness in Cavendish. She is constantly producing and constantly creating, and I want to, I know that I'm running out of time here, so I want to end by thinking too about how she appropriates how other people view her potential madness, and that she takes these terms and really spins them and makes them her own, creates her own terminology. So I'm suggesting that we can think about Cavendish in her fiction and her philosophy as articulating a connection between the brain and the misfiring brain, especially as a propagative entity, and that disease and specifically mental illness are being positive, productive, and creative forces. So she frequently repurposes her peers' conceptions of her, and she pushes them into the creative realm. And here I'll finish with this mention of the dedicatory from the dedicatory epistle to her brother-in-law, Charles Cavendish, at the start of Poems and Fancy. So she says, "True it is, spinning with the fingers is more proper to our sex than studying or writing poetry, which is spinning with the brain. But I, having no skill in the art of the first, made me delight in the latter, since all brains work naturally and incessantly in some degree or other, which made me endeavor to spin a garment of memory, to lap up my name that it might grow after ages." I think we can all agree that she's been successful in this, and that the madness and the mental illness and the destabilization of these restless thoughts are actually what enabled her to produce and to produce in such an incredible manner. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leanne. That was so fascinating. And you picked up, like, I hadn't really covered any of the literary representations of madness and her continued turn towards that hyper productivity that, again, could spin so easily into madness. And we see that so much later in the 18th century as well. So she seems to provide a really crucial kind of link. Thank you. Okay, we'll discuss all that later. So our second speaker today is Jonathan Shaheen, who is a postdoctoral researcher of the research organization Flanders at Ghent University, as well as a guest researcher at Stockholm University. And I think he's speaking with us today from Sweden. He's working on a monograph on Cavendish's metaphysics, provisionally titled The Superheroic Margaret Cavendish and the Metaphysics of Only Nature. But more importantly, he's been running 2 weekly Cavendish-related reading groups since February 2020. Some information can be found on his website, which is johnshaheen.com. I don't have a color printer, and I can barely read the website, but correct me if that's not right. And that's JONSHAHEEN.com. And interested parties are encouraged to contact him. Thank you for posting that for further information. Okay, so I will turn the floor over to him.
Cool, thank you. Let me share my screen. That's probably it. And that's probably how it's supposed to look. Thanks for inviting me to take part, to all of you who are organizing. And I'm also very jealous of the t-shirt and feel my 6-year-old stylist should be fired for not finding it. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about what Cavendish thinks the metaphysics of mental illness is. So this is going to be, I guess, in a way similar to the stuff that Anne was saying. And Anne doesn't miss much, but I have to. I think I found something that will be interesting. So let me get to it. So as Anne was saying, The mind isn't all that special for Cavendish. So, but the first thing we need to ask, if we're going to talk about mental illness, is, well, what is this mind? What's the mental thing? And of course, I guess we all know for Cavendish that human minds aren't particularly special in comparison with animal minds. So man is singular in this, and I guess that means only this, that he's of an upright and straight shape, of which no other animal but man is. So eventually his organ pipes, nerves, sinews, and joints are in a straight and equal posture to each other, which is the cause. Man's tongue and organs are more apt for speech than those of any other creature. And by the way, I think this is sort of incorporated in the blazing world. If you think about, in what way are, for example, the worm men half men? I think the answer is that they're standing upright and can talk, but otherwise they know worm stuff. So that's what I think that hybridization is about. Side note. Okay, human minds not special relative to animal minds, also not special in general, right? Because Cavendish is also a panpsychist. So when Cavendish wants to account for the rational soul of man, she says this natural soul, otherwise called reason, is nothing else but corporeal natural self-motion, or a particle of the purest, most subtle and active part of matter, which I call animate. Which animate matter is the life and soul of nature. And the life part is sensitive matter and the soul part is rational matter. The life and soul of nature, and consequently of man and all other creatures. So there's nothing like a Leibniz's mill problem for Cavendish when she makes sense of the rational soul in terms of matter. She thinks that all she has to say to account for the cognitive abilities of humans is to say that their rational soul is just the rational matter that's in them. So that tells you something about the capacities of rational matter in general, if all it takes to account for the cognitive faculties of humans is pointing at their rational matter. Okay, so human minds aren't special versus animal minds. Minds in general, animal minds in general aren't special relative to nature. So however we're going to make sense of mental illness as a kind of disorder will just be however we make sense of disorder generally. And that's basically what Cavendish says, right? So in late Cavendish, at least, she seems to concede this claim, and it's a little bit more complicated for the reasons that Anne noticed. Cavendish seems to concede this claim that all diseases proceed but from irregular motions. All right, there's also the stuff about caused by conceit or operating by rote. But she concedes in this exchange, right? She puts this in someone else's mouth. She says all diseases proceed but from irregular motions. I answer, these irregular motions are so numerous, different, and various that all the artists in nature are not able to rectify them. Her point here is that there is no universal medicine, but it's not that diseases proceed from something other than irregular motions, right? So she sort of she concedes that in this passage, that indeed it's all about irregular motion. This is in late Cavendish, and the reason I say that is that the stuff that Anne noticed about decay of vital parts is more elaborate and more present earlier. So like in the 1663 edition of PPO, there's also mistempering or distempering of matter, which has to do with the fact that in PPO, but not necessarily later, inanimate matter comes in degrees and tempers as well, and you kind of have to respect them to get things to work out right. In OEP and grounds, inanimate matter is just this like undifferentiated stuff, but that's not true in PPO. Okay, side note. By late Cavendish, it's all just about disorder. Disordered motions. And because it's just about disordered motions, and in fact, even in PPO, mental madness in particular is just about disordered motions, that suggests a sort of surprising treatment, which is sort of any way that you could get the motions to become orderly again would fix it. So she says, there's great reason why music should cure madness in the mind. For this sort of madness is no other but the rational matter and motions that are in the brain and heart, put out of their natural motion. And the rational matter and motions having a natural sympathy with music may be composed into their right order, but it must be such music, etc., like the right kind of music. It's got to have the right rhythm or whatever to be orderly. Okay, so that's what mental illness is about, just disordered motions. The fact that it's disordered motions suggests that any kind of treatment that could get the motions to get back in the right order would work, as long as it's targeted at their particular irregularity. But I want to ask, and here I think we get kind of an interesting question, whether mental illnesses are themselves, if they're about what rational matter is doing, is mental illness itself somehow rational? So here's like a standard Cavendish tension. How is nature's regular order supposed to be consistent with local disorder? And you go to the literature and you find some answers. Maybe nature's order is violable, can be violated because of free will. Or maybe the so-called disorders only look disordered from our parochial perspective, or maybe the local disorders are somehow necessary or part of nature's overarching order or balance. You can find those answers. And we can ask the question then, sort of transforming it a little bit, how is rational matter's rationality consistent with mental illness? And we can try out, sort of mutatis mutandum, mutandis, whatever it is, try out the corresponding answers. I don't think we want to say that rational matter can be anything other than rational, or we'll lose a grip on what we're talking about. But the other answers seem reasonably plausible. Maybe mental illness only looks irrational from our parochial perspective, or maybe mental illness is necessary for a part of rational matter's rationality. But that gives rise to a question, which I think is probably a good question. What's the actual relationship between human rationality and rational matter's rationality? So, and this is supposed to be like the question, what's the relationship between human good and divine good if God does stuff that looks evil to us and so on, right? Where like the possible answers are good in exactly the same sense, good in a merely analogous sense, good in a completely different sense. We can here say, well, maybe, rational matter is rational in the same sense that humans are rational, or a merely analogous sense, or a completely different sense. We should find the answer to that question in Cavendish. And I think we can if we look at what disorder is. So what is order in Cavendish? Well, this is the kind of thing I think everybody talks about. I'm going to call it nature's regular order. She appeals to it when she says, there be sense and reason, which is not only motion, but a regular and well-ordered self-motion, apparent in the wonderful and various productions, generations, transformations, dissolutions, compositions, and other actions of nature, in all nature's parts and particles. So that is the regular and well-ordered self-motion that is apparent. We can see it, right? This is something that needs to be explained. Here's a quote that's not actually Cavendish, but I think Cavendish agrees with it. We shouldn't presume that it's disorder that requires an explanation, right? Accounts that say that the order that nature has is somehow divinely imposed then create for themselves a problem of explaining how the order can never fail. How can there ever be disorder if God put the order there? This I learned from Marcy Lascano as a way of thinking about certain accounts in the literature of where the order is coming from God. You really have a problem then in explaining disorder, which is why freedom plays such a big role in those accounts. But we shouldn't presume disorder is the thing that requires explanation. Order is the thing that requires explanation, right? Order must have been a task, a problem that's been more or less successfully solved. This isn't a Cavendish quote, but I think Cavendish agrees with it. And I think that's why Cavendish, when she argues for her view, she seems to think that the ubiquity of animate matter is what best explains nature's regular order. So indeed, it is the regular order in nature that requires explanation, and Cavendish's metaphysics is supposed to be that explanation. So that's not the only kind of order in nature. People sometimes read all of Cavendish's order comments as being about that same order. So this is a popular passage where people read the bolded part out of context. So all the motions are so ordered by nature's wisdom as not anything in nature can be otherwise, unless by a supernatural command and power of God. Some of you have heard me say this before. So ordered, meaning ordered how? Well, ordered in the following way, so that things can't be different. So Cunning reads this as a statement of determinism. Boyle reads this as a statement of once God sets up the rules for the proper motions of parts of nature, they can't be changed without God changing them. I think that so doesn't point forward cataphorically. I think it points backwards anaphorically. So things are ordered so that there's the commixture of those mentioned parts of animate and inanimate matter. And if you look at the full context of this passage, the whole thing is about complete blending. So the complete blending is the order that's at issue here that can't be changed except by God, right? So the thing that can't be otherwise is that even the smallest conceivable or imaginable parts or particles of nature are composites of animate and inanimate matter, which you probably heard me say a lot if you've heard me before. So that order, by the way, that constitutive order, that complete blending, that is inviolable, right? That is not anything in nature can be otherwise. It's such that not anything in nature can be otherwise unless by supernatural command and power of God. Nature's regular order, the orderly behavior of its parts, is naturally violable, because it's an accomplishment of animate, including rational matter. It's something that rational matter has to manage to do. But along the way to trying to do it, it will have to tear things apart, and there will be other disorders. So I'll remind you of some things and I'll answer my question. Cavendish thinks regular order gets explained by the ubiquity of animate matter. That's how she argues for her metaphysics. And then those what animate matter is able to do, right? In order to do its job, it has to have some tendencies towards sympathetic motions, for example. Those can not only cause, but also cure through music, mental illness. Those same sympathetic tendencies that can cause and cure mental illness allow rational matter to organize nature. So my question was, this was headed towards an answer, what's the actual relationship between human rationality and rational matter's rationality? I think they have to be rationality in exactly the same sense. So I think they have to be rationality in exactly the same sense. Humans and rational matter are both rational in that sense. Recall, rational matter is the soul of nature and consequently of man. So it's the rationality of nature that men have, the rationality of the soul of nature, that is rational matter, that men have. But rational matter also has this larger scale aim, ordering all of nature. That's a larger scale aim than human rationality has. And so it will sometimes produce mental illness because it's going for different things. So I think there's an interesting point here where the rationality of rational matter sometimes will have to do with moving sympathetically with things that are in its immediate area, and that sort of smaller scale than human minds, which are things that have to do with particular creatures, which are larger than those smallest bits of rational matter. But also rational matter, I think, is engaged in this broader project of ordering all of nature, and that's larger scale. So that's how the rationality of rational matter can be consistent with something that is paradigmatically irrational, insofar as mental illness is that. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was so interesting. And you were so much more thorough in so many areas too. So you didn't overlap with me at all, actually. That was great. Okay, so on to our third speaker, Stephen Klukas, who is a reader in early modern intellectual history at Birkbeck University of London. He has published several articles on Cavendish's natural philosophy and edited one of the first collections of essays dedicated to her work, which was A Princely Brave Woman, Essays on Margaret Cavendish, which was in 2003. And many of us, of course, are familiar with his work on Cavendish and with that specific edition, of course, too. And he's currently editing with Timothy Rayler, Thomas Hobbes's De Corpora and related manuscripts for the Clarendon edition of the works of Thomas Hobbes. So I will turn the floor over to him, our final speaker.
Thank you so much, Anne. Let me just share my screen. And while I do that, apologize if some of what I'm about to say sounds familiar to you. I'm suffering from the problem of being the last speaker, in that some of the things I was going to mention have already been mentioned. But it means we're all thinking in the same direction, so I think this is a good thing. In a preface to her observations on experimental philosophy, Cavendish both acknowledges and dismisses the idea that her prodigious output of writings might be a symptom of a mental illness. And this is the quotation we've already heard from Leanne. It is probable, she wrote, some will say that my much writing is a disease. I do very believe they will not take it to be a disease of the brain. Perhaps they will say it is an extravagant, or at least a fantastical disease, but I hope they will rather call it a disease of wit. But let them give it what name they please, yet of this I am sure, that if much writing be a disease, then the best philosophers, as also the best divines, lawyers, physicians, poets, historians, orators, mathematicians, chemists, and many more have been grievously sick. What some might see as an unseemly logorrhea is rather an abundance of ingenious wit, a condition she shared with her scholarly contemporaries. One might add that even today, writing is an activity which is still viewed with incomprehension in some corners, sadly, sometimes in governments. Cavendish stoutly defended her right to employ what she variously calls natural fancies, natural reason, and regular reason, although she was aware that her thoughts could appear erratic to some. In a series of poems prefacing her philosophical fancies of 1653, Cavendish wrote an epistle to her museful thoughts, in which she exhorts the thoughts to dance with the muses in measured feet, which are both wild, like toyish girls, and sober, grave. In a poetic dialogue between reason and her thoughts, reason urges the thoughts not to run in such strange, fantastic ways, suggesting that they choose instead a beaten path, lest they be considered mad. Her thoughts, however, reply with a demand for libertas philosophandi. Reason, forbear, our study not molest, for we do go those ways that best please us best. Nature doth give us liberty to run without a check, more swift far than the sun. In a poem entitled Another to My Thoughts, she sees strange opinions passage as the only way for her imprisoned thoughts to escape, although then when they find a way, they run so fast, no reason can persuade to stay their haste. In the world's Olio, Cavendish insisted that wit is wild, fantastical, and therefore must have no set rules. For rules curb and shackle it, and in that bondage it dies. It requires instead a perpetual motion with continual changes and varieties. Cavendish's thought then seems to exist in an uneasy relationship with the restraints of reason, teetering on the brink of wildness and even madness. There are certainly philosophical grounds in Cavendish's thought for this uneasy relationship. In her epistemology, which took its mature form in her philosophical letters of 1664 and in the grounds, there is no inherently stable causal connection between the mind and the external world, as perception and cognition are dependent not on mechanical causes, but on the voluntary imitative behavior or patterning of self-moving matter. So, for example, our image in a mirror is not caused by reflected light rays, but by the self-moving matter of the mirror choosing to imitate our figure. Our shadow on a wall is not caused by our body's obstruction of light rays, but by the self-moving matter of the wall choosing to imitate the outline of our body. Cavendish repeatedly tells us that this rational matter, both in the mind and in the material world, is in perpetual motion and is disposed towards variation. Nature, she says, takes delight in variety. So how is it that we are able to attain a reasonably stable account of the world? Why is it that nature does not choose to constantly mutate from moment to moment, although of course in a certain sense it does? Why does our cat not transform itself into a camel or a sewing machine as it crosses the room? It is because nature is wise, prudent, regular, and avoids extremes or extravagancies. Nature's motions, she said, are not extravagant, but orderly, temperate, free, and easy. Although nature's motions are sometimes extravagant, yet in her fundamental actions, there is no extravagancy. Nature is infinite and has infinite free will, but for the most part, chooses those motions which conduce to the stable continuance of the universe. Nature hath but one law, which is a wise law, viz., to keep infinite matter in order. There is no confusion in nature, everything is orderly and methodical. Nature's actions are infinite, she says in Observations upon the Experimental Philosophy, but they are poised and balanced so that they cannot run into extremes. If this is the case, how is it that irregularities or disorder occurs in the universe? And here I feel some overlap with what Jonathan was saying a moment ago. Cavendish's holistic view of infinite nature means that everything which occurs is natural, even though to an human individual or part of nature, it might appear to be unnatural or pathological. That which man names war, sickness, sleep, death, and the like, Cavendish says in philosophical letters, are but various particular actions of the only matter. So, pathological conditions like physical or mental illnesses are just particular temporary actions of an infinitely self-changing nature. We perceive them to be disorders, but this isn't actually the case. They are, in fact, part of nature's freely chosen design. So this is, Jonathan was talking about the idea of our parochial view of certain kinds of motions. There are contraries in nature's actions which are corporal motions, which cause mixtures, qualities, degrees, discords, as also harmonious conjunctions and concords and like effects. Health and diseases, she wrote, are nothing else but the regularity and irregularity of sensitive corporal motions. But where does irregularity arise? Why does nature sometimes exceed the boundaries of her wise and prudent governance? The answer would appear to be variety. Nature makes irregularities for variety's sake, but she is more careful of her regular actions, and thus nature, taking delight in variety, suffers irregularities. For otherwise, if there were only regularities, there could be not so much variety. Cavendish allows for the existence of irregularity because she is committed to a view of the universe that is both rationally ordered and creative, or generative, productive. Without irregularity, there would be no variety in the universe, no copia. For Cavendish, nature is both a logos and a logos poetikos. Ultimately, of course, because of Cavendish's probabilism, which is ultimately grounded on the belief that it is impossible for an individual part of nature to know nature's infinite whole, any rational account of the world has to be partial, in at least two senses of that word. However ingenious or witty the interpreter is, no matter how much they exclude symbolizing expressions or poetical fancies from their philosophy, and however much they rely on the workings of regular reason and rational probability, there will always be an unknowable excess or remainder in the perpetual superabundance of nature's activities. Nature's actions are not only curious, but very various. Not only various, but very obscure, insomuch as the most ingenious artist cannot trace her ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was so lovely and so interesting. And I'm so delighted that we all managed to cover a lot of different angles and almost entirely different topics, even though we're kind of circling around the same core concept. Thank you very much. So I think I'll turn this over to our organizers. It's time for our breaking into.
Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope the breakouts were really productive for everyone. And at this point, it's kind of our usual shtick to just kind of ask the moderators of each breakout room to give a little bit of information about what was going on in their rooms. I can tell you that in discussions with Anne Fell's group, which included Tanya Schmidt and Brooke Sharp, we were talking about we were covering a lot of ground, but some of our conversations that spearheaded towards basically a fundamental question: why does nature both supposedly love order, according to Cavendish, but also seem to really take delight in variety, as Stephen Klukas told us, to the point where that variety can be, let's say, non-benign towards a number of different creatures in ways that Cavendish seems to need no need to apologize for. There's no theodicy of nature. There's a kind of indifference of nature to its own variety. That was one of our kind of key questions. And the other one, bear with us, was what would it be like to have mental illness as a rock, or in mineral kind or an animal kind? Would we be able as humans to perceive that experience? Does Cavendish really think that mental illness is really available to all of these species? Clearly, metaphysically, it holds. It's something she doesn't seem to explore in her poetics nearly as much. And then Anne kind of brought us all together under this kind of key framework of, it seems to be that there's a division between how Cavendish does her philosophy and does her literature when it comes to mental illness. There's something very clear, propositional, philosophical about the approach in the philosophy. And then there's a very different room to play with mental illness when it comes to the fiction and to the poetics, perhaps. Really interesting to explore when Cavendish does let a kind of divide emerge in the many disciplines that she covers. So those are some of our thoughts, but I'd love to hear from anybody in the other rooms. I don't know if you could report on what was going on in yours.
Yeah, I mean, just like you said, we covered a ton of ground. So I've put a recap in the chat room, but this barely touches the surface. One of the really interesting things that we discussed was the concept of morality. And so one of the questions was, can irregularity or regularity be seen as moral or not moral? And then, of course, I think it was Melanie came up with this really interesting reading of morality as circumstantial. So depending on the context of the character in the particular play or romance, Cavendish focuses on different elements of morality. There were also some really interesting ideas discussed, links between Milton and Cavendish and their individual vitalisms, as well as the extent to which Cavendish's philosophy is Hobbesian. And then, of course, we talked about the concepts of free will and what Cavendish believes about free will, as well as the idea that not all parts are free, that some parts are regulated or moderated by, higher up parts. So yeah, we covered a lot of information, and I will definitely encourage or invite my folks to share more.
Awesome. And as we keep doing a little tour de table, can we hear from Marina, which I think was Marina and Sergio?
Yes, we had a very intimate group. It was me and Sergio, so I must admit there was some catching up to do. But no, actually, Sergio led with, I thought, an excellent question, which I'm very happy to have the opportunity to sort of turn back to the people who could actually speak to this. But he was saying that we didn't really talk about gendered madness, right? Like what, given that for women, where that genius resides in the body, right? For men, the fertility of sort of the masculine eccentric brain, but for women, obviously the hysterical, the womb, et cetera. So anyway, since there's a kind of materiality and physicality to how sort of early moderns talked about madness and how it got gendered, just in some ways, I think that was such a key question. I'd love to give him an opportunity to ask the speakers to respond to that. Anybody?
That's such an interesting question. And it's something that has not come up yet, to my knowledge, and it didn't come up in our group either. But Cavendish is a kind of outlier in this way as well, in terms of, I think, not linking madness to gender in any way, because everything, all bodies, everything in nature is made up of the same basic stuff. And so that's fascinating to see her operating within a kind of totally different tradition of the ideology of madness, just in that it is not, I don't think, other people might disagree, linked to gender necessarily, but I'll ask
and
her.
we were trying to think even in the imaginative literature in the plays or something. And
yeah,
she doesn't tend to even play with mad women, as a type, and that seems, obviously a deliberate choice. I mean, the women may be regarded as mad for withdrawing from the men in the convent of pleasure, or any other situation, number of situations, but they are not represented as sort of antic or mad generally.
Leanne, I wonder if you could put this in context for the period, because you've worked on this as well. Could you say more?
I find it really fascinating because what I'm interested in is Cavendish's representation, as well as the context in which she's representing herself. And in the period, especially in the late 17th, early 18th centuries, it's a poetic kind of literary trope for a male author to represent himself as having a pregnancy, as the idea is a conception. It grows in his mind, and then it has a more or less difficult birth. And there are all these dedicatory epistles about, with thanks to my various midwives who are also men, and the male midwife being another trope entirely. But yeah, it's that this idea of creativity and for many male authors in the period is one of natural pregnancy in the masculine mind. Whereas for Cavendish, that she doesn't, to my knowledge, and everyone should feel free to correct me, but she doesn't actually co-opt the same kind of metaphors. Her brain is a container, and the thoughts are moving inside, but that idea of pregnancy and childbirth doesn't seem to enter into what she's talking about. But that's just that's my own thoughts on the matter.
She does consider her text her progeny fairly often, but the specific pregnancy metaphor, I'm not familiar with in her work either.
Her works are her children, but there isn't the sort of mechanism, the biological mechanism that underlies the creative process. Yeah.
Well, I mean, thank you for this response. I just wanted to say one other thing in our group that we talked about that I think could be interesting to bring back to the speakers in the group at large. And one of them really has to do with sort of teaching in a literature classes room versus a sort of philosophy classroom, and how I think we all tend to use interdisciplinary examples, but whether we can think of the sort of literary works as providing kind of experiments, or right, if they observe the same physical philosophical principles, I guess. So so just a general question about sort of interdisciplinarity and how one picks one's examples and what kind of status they have. I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that. I mean, Jonathan, you don't seem to use literary examples very often. Is that because you don't find them useful, or you don't think they necessarily behave in orderly fashion as they might need to illustrate the points you're working on?
I mean, I do have a thing about what's going on in the blazing world, but I read it as a recapitulation of her natural philosophy. So, I mean, this isn't going to connect that closely with what you guys are talking about, but this is how I think about her her thing. So I read it as an allegory for her natural philosophy. So the Empress is allegorically nature, the Emperor is allegorically God, he empowers nature and then disappears. And the societies, for example, are allegorically societies of parts. So of course they get broken up because societies dissolve. That's what nature does. But so I read it all through what I think the philosophical points are supposed to be. So we were talking about this in our room as well. What is the significance of, for example, the Empress being female? I mean, most people who read The Blazing World are really struck by this, there being this female monarch in this seemingly ideal, wonderful society. But some of the comments about the Empress's gender are just there because the Empress is an allegory for nature. So the Empress's love of variety, which has been read, for example, as evidence that absolute monarchy is dangerous because absolute monarchs can rule from whim. Well, the Empress only loves variety because nature loves variety, and the Empress is allegorically nature. So there's nothing evaluative going on there at all, as far as I can tell. So I think it's not always a gender political point being made. Sometimes it's just a philosophy going on. But because I read everything through the philosophy, I think I just talk. It's easier to just talk about what the philosophy says.
This raises a really interesting question, I think, that because when I work with Cavendish's fiction, I always have a tendency to view her fiction as like this it offers her this kind of dimensionality, so she can assume these different positions to interrogate or to perform her philosophy and see how it pans out, like in these worlds that she creates. And I've always found it really difficult to separate her philosophy and her fiction, but in this topic specifically, and this came up in our breakout room as well, there seems like this kind of interesting divide in how she describes madness, mental illness on a physiological level, and then how she tends to kind of to perform it or assume that the persona of the mad author in her writing, in her poetry, in her fiction, in her prefaces as well. So there seems to be this kind of interesting disjuncture, I think, a generic distinction, perhaps. And I also think it's really interesting that Cavendish is starting to link, at least in like that meta commentary, in terms of all of her prefaces and introductions, she's starting to link that creative genius and imagination and madness in ways that we see like recapitulated across the 18th century. We usually think about this whole link between like the mad genius author in the very late 18th century actually too. And so I think we see Cavendish performing that pretty early here. But again, there seems to be a kind of distinction in terms of like how she talks about her persona, her work, her hyper productive brain, in regards to herself and her writing, and then how she describes it as a kind of panpsychic phenomenon across nature too, which is interesting.
Well, I want to hand it over the floor to Liza just to hear a little bit about what was going on in your group as well. But any also thank you for the wonderful reference I think you put in the chat for everybody in response to Patricia's question. But anything you want to add, Liza?
Yeah, so in our group, we talked a little bit about how, and this is mainly what I said, but then conversation came after it. Leanne's paper actually sort of interestingly cut across the other two papers. So rather than thinking about madness in terms of irregularity of motion, Leanne was interested in thinking about the links between sort of madness, imagination, and creativity, and how what Cavendish is doing is sort of very different than her contemporaries on those sort of linkages. And so we were thinking a lot about the sort of generativity of madness or mental illness, the possibility that she was maybe taking some accusations that had been made against her and sort of revaluing them. And then we ended by thinking a little bit about melancholy, which is sort of, sometimes a physical disease, sometimes a mental disease. And then Marina provided this, it was Margaret Reeves, provided this wonderful discussion of melancholy from World's Olio that she pasted in the chat for us. And we sort of noticed that her description of melancholy as sort of the brain filled with busy fancies seems to sound an awful lot like when she describes her own writing process. And then we were cruelly recalled to the main group right as we made that exciting discovery. But that's
it's always so painful, Liza. I'm glad you said that. And obviously, you know the poems and fancies probably better than anyone else. Am I right that that's where she talks about the brain as kind of a beehive, or a brain as like as thoughts, something like that can sting and that can genuinely hurt.
I posted this in the chat, but part 3, which is the only section of the book that's fancies. So all the other book has poems, and then only part 3 has the fancies, which is why it's poems and fancies in the title. But part 3 has several poems where she's like the brain compared to a garden, the brain compared to an oven, the brain compared to a beehive, where she's sort of trying out all these different models of the brain. But yeah, the beehive is one of them.
And we were talking about the pancakes in the pan, thanks to Leanne. But yeah, what's fascinating, and I'm realizing with hindsight, is all these different attempts to give a kind of physical manifestation to what the brain is and what the thoughts, particularly within the brain, are. Psychoanalysts in the room, or anybody who works with mental illness, would probably know that there's a really large tendency in like AA groups or other anonymous groups to try to somatize thought and just kind of say, like, what does it feel like when the addiction starts hitting you? What does it feel like when the depression hits you? And the need for metaphor becomes like absolutely agonizing. Susan Sontag has obviously written on illness as metaphor and finds that like a really, really helpful analogy. And she means metaphor loosely. It can be simile as well. but it strikes me that Cavendish is doing a lot of this work for Sontag ahead of time. I wanted to give Melanie Holm the floor really quickly, because you raised a question, Melanie, about kind of how much we should expect the texts all to kind of cohere with each other philosophically and propositionally. Was that you, Melanie? Yeah, could you unmute for us and then hear your thoughts?
I'm the worst. I'm always the person who's muted when they're talking and not muted when other people are talking, so I apologize. Well, no, it's a question that that comes to me a lot. And when it was brought up, where do we draw our examples from? When Jonathan was asked that, and Stephen commented on it, how much do we look for something like a coherence across these genres? And Anne was beginning to speak to this in thinking through the prefaces and the experimental nature, or using the fictional prose as a place of experimentation for her philosophy, or a stage for thinking through consequences of it from different personas. But how much do we look for, or I guess verify ideas from one, the more intellectually focused natural philosophical writings from the more fanciful writings? I mean, even though her natural philosophy is somewhat fanciful, as I think we'd all agree, and it's the better for it. I wonder whether or not we should sort of like test the hypotheses of the one in the other on some level, or if we should look at them as separate.
Can I say something about this? So this is what I mean by superheroic, actually, in the book title. So I stole it from this debate between a couple of historians of philosophy over whether it's okay to sort of read every book by a thinker as if they're engaged in the same project all the time, which, you know, the person who doesn't like this alleges turns them into a superhero that is flattens them and makes them less realistic. So the project of my book is to try to read Cavendish as consistent, basically from Poems and Fancies, which looks rather inconsistent with everything else, all the way through Grounds and all of the, you know, philosophical treatises and critical works, but also in The Blazing World, as basically pushing a consistent view. One that she's developing over time that goes through some changes, and I'm very happy that Liza exists to help me get Poems and Fancies to be more consistent with the rest of it. But I think that you can actually get a really long way reading her that way. And I think a lot of what happens in The Blazing World is very carefully controlled by the philosophical points that she's trying to make. So it's not just like there are no rules for what she's going to say. So I think one can get a long way, but I think that's like a, you know, that's a method. So, you know, here's the superheroic method. Let me read her as trying to do the same thing all the time and see how much I can account for. And I can tell you the answer won't be everything, because like Sociable Letters has just different stuff going on, because it's about her metaphysics, so not about political issues really at all. But I think that's a method that's definitely worth pursuing, and that you can get surprisingly far with relative to what you might have expected if you just read what people say about her in the literature. And I learned that from you guys, by the way, that, you know, things like OEP and The Blazing World should be read together. Although I went the other direction than I think the English professors were going, in the sense that I want to read The Blazing World as just observations. Anyway, sorry.
Well, I wonder, I just want to add to what Jonathan said. I mean, I agree that I think that she actually is trying to present a fairly kind of almost unified body of thought in her later career. But I wonder, to follow Melanie's point, like how much her natural philosophy actually kind of allures us down this path of seeing everything as connected, because she draws this system of this theory of everything that has this like kind of dense symmetry built into it. And so we perhaps like approach her texts in a certain way, expecting that they all function in similar ways. And she does seem to approach genre as a series of different critical postures, and these topics recur. And then, as Jonathan said, she's with these texts being published the way that they are, often you know, adjoined, as she says, like she seems to be inviting us to make these comparisons, which isn't to say that we necessarily flatten distinctions in terms of what she's saying in, let's say, Blazing World and Observations, but it is interesting that she seems to be kind of requiring us or teasing us and asking us how these approaches differ and what kind of knowledge they produce, and how they might or might not overlap. But it does seem like she allows herself a lot more free rein in her fiction. And the appendix to Grounds is a really good example of this, because that's where she's really kind of like at play with ideas in that whole final third of the text. And that reads as kind of like philosophy as fiction in some way, where she's exploring all these possibilities that aren't necessarily true and aren't really tenable in philosophy proper and in the main structure of her work. And so they appear in an appendix. So she seems to offer these kind of proliferating viewpoints to view her work. And I do think that reading across her work late, as Jonathan mentioned, is rewarding. And I think she wants us to do that to a certain degree. But then I also sympathize with this question about like why we necessarily do that, or why we expect them to be consistent across all these different genres, or whether we should do that. Yeah, that's an interesting.
I wonder, and if David Cunning or Stephen Klukas could chime in as well, since David, you've also read Cavendish primarily as a philosopher.
Yeah.
You know, I was going to weigh in and say that I really appreciated, Melanie, your question. I think I tend to read Cavendish, it's as an interpretation, right? So it could be mistaken, but the idea is if Cavendish is a systematic thinker who's consistent across most of her texts, then here are the views to which she subscribes. And it's partly because there seem to be some positions she puts forward that are non-negotiable for her. Like that it's impossible for there to be an immaterial motion, right? Or that it's impossible for there to be the kind of order that there is if matter doesn't think and isn't perceptive. And so if those are non-negotiable, then the thought is, well, it would be important to read any apparent counter texts to somehow square with those non-negotiable positions. But at the same time, I get worried when she talks about reason as a faculty for knowledge. Presumably it's by way of reason that we know a lot of this stuff, like that there can be no immaterial motion. And if it is by reason that we know that stuff, she also, we need to note that she says things like that reason gives us probable knowledge, reason might be getting at how things are. She uses some pretty weak language. It's very speculative. And if so, then the thought is maybe she is saying, well, this seems right. Let's see where it takes us. Or maybe that other thing seems right. Let's see where that takes us. If so, then I think there's a lot of opportunity, Melanie, for doing the kind of thing that you're suggesting.
Stephen, I'm curious if there's anything you would add.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the quotation that I provided from the poem prefacing the Philosophical Fancies, where she polarizes her thoughts and reason. So it's really interesting because, of course, when she's philosophizing, she very often talks about regular reason and rational probability and all those kinds of things. I mean, over the arc of her career, she starts talking less and less about wit and fancy, I think, and starts talking more about reason, and starts to use poetical fancies as a kind of term of abuse. But in that early stage where she seems to be saying, well, there's reason on the one hand, and I guess, if you like, it's a kind of orthodox reason that is debating with her. And so her thought is seen as something wild, strange opinions, she calls them, and not following the beaten path of orthodox rationality. And that's important to her, and it's important to her, I think, as a woman, because when she calls her thoughts imprisoned, well, why are they imprisoned? Why is her thought imprisoned? Why does she need to escape? And it seems to me that that wildness, that strangeness is something which she needs to escape, but there is a danger inherent in that. And I think that's why she's constantly thinking about the boundaries between madness and strangeness, because in a way she needs productive strangeness. She needs irregularity, actually, her own irregularity. In her own irregularity of thought is something which is valuable to her, and of course that irregularity becomes a singularity. Yeah, sorry, I'm kind of going off in all different directions with that, but that's what David's response just made me think of.
Going off in all directions, if you haven't noticed, is the modus operandi of the online Olios. we are sadly at time. I have this cruel job, Liza, of having to tell everybody to go home or go into rooms. I do want to propose that in future Olios, since our conversations do seem to bleed over the next hour, we'll make available a after party Zoom link for those who want to just continue chatting or catch up about Cavendish studies more broadly. I think it's something we just need to institute at this point, because we're regularly coming to great cusps in the conversation and then having to shut off. So it sounds like we can make it happen. Sophie, yeah, let's do it. Okay. And I want to hand the floor over to you just to say any last words, but otherwise it's thank you from all three of us who organized. And floor is yours.
I have many more questions, but I will not ask them at this point. I might email some of you to get your thoughts on some of this, because I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this super interesting conversation. And thank you for coming and showing up and talking to us today and listening. These events are like one positive offshoot of this bizarre and awful year, because we were all joined together across the globe in this way. So this is so nice. So thank you guys so much for organizing this, and thank you so much to our speakers too. That was fantastic.